The silk of Lady Evelyn's gown was never meant for the grit of the Nevada basin. It was a delicate pale lavender thing, imported from Paris and fitted in Philadelphia. But now it was torn, stained with the red clay of the desert, and clinging to her skin in the suffocating, airless heat of the afternoon. The world had ended for Evelyn 20 minutes ago, when the carriage wheels had screeched to a halt and the driver's body had hit the dust with a heavy final thud. Now, she was no longer a governor's daughter. She was a ledger entry. She was a debt being collected. Behind her, she felt the solid, terrifying heat of Caleb Cross. He sat on the massive black stallion like he was carved from the same dark rock as the canyons surrounding them. He was a bounty hunter, a man whose name was whispered in saloons to quiet the rowdy and frighten the wicked. He hadn't snatched her to hurt her, not yet. He had taken her as collateral. Her brother, Julian, had gambled away money that wasn't his, and in the lawless territories, when you couldn't pay in gold, you paid in blood. Or in this case, in the safety of the only person Julian loved. Evelyn struggled, her breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps. The corset she wore felt like a cage of whalebone and irony, crushing her lungs as she tried to slide off the horse's back. She wanted to fall, even if it meant breaking her ankles on the sun-baked earth. Anything was better than the feeling of Caleb's massive arm wrapped around her waist. "Let me go," she hissed, her voice cracking. "My father will have your head for this. There isn't a lawman in the territory who won't be hunting you by sundown." Caleb didn't even flinch. His arm, thick as a fence post and just as unyielding, tightened around her middle. He pulled her flush against his chest, her back hitting the solid leather of his vest. She could feel the hard lines of his muscles, the cold steel of the revolvers holstered at his hips, and the steady, terrifyingly calm thrum of his heart. "Quit your squirming, lady." Caleb's voice was a deep, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate through her entire body. "Your father's lawmen don't come this far out, and the ones that do usually work for the men I'm delivering you to. We've got 20 miles of open desert before we find so much as a shadow, and this horse is already carrying double. You keep fighting the rhythm, and you'll kill the beast before we hit the halfway mark." "I don't care about the horse," Evelyn cried, her eyes stinging with tears of rage. "I would rather walk until my feet bleed and the vultures circle than spend another second pressed against a murderous animal like you." The horse came to a sudden, jarring halt. Caleb pulled the reins so sharply that the stallion reared back slightly, its hooves kicking up a cloud of red dust. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic, heavy breathing of the animal. Caleb leaned forward, his arms, head dipping low over her shoulder. His breath was hot against her ear, smelling of black coffee and the dry iron scent of the trail. His rough stubble grazed the sensitive skin of her neck, sending a shiver of pure, cold electricity down her spine. "You want to walk?" he whispered, and the threat in his voice was sharper than any blade. "Look around you, Evelyn. This is the Mojave. There are things out here that haven't eaten in a week, and a piece of soft Philadelphia silk like you would be a godsend to 'em. You keep fighting me, and I'll take you off this horse right now. I'll leave you to the sand and the coyotes." He paused, his hand shifting from the reins to the side of her neck, his thumb grazing her jawline with a terrifying, possessive familiarity. "But mark my words, if I put you down, you'll be begging to get back up. And if you make me stop this hunt again, you'll ride me before you ever touch that saddle again." The words hit her like a physical blow. The implication was a dark, heavy weight that settled in her gut, making her mouth go dry. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked at his hands, calloused, scarred, and capable of a violence she couldn't even imagine. This was a man who lived by the gun, a man who saw her only as a prize to be guarded. "Do you understand?" he rasped. Evelyn managed a small, jerky nod. She couldn't speak. The refined lady she had been that morning, the woman who worried about the placement of forks and the shade of her ribbons, was gone. In her place was someone raw and terrified, realizing for the first time that her name, her status, and her beauty meant nothing in the shadow of a man like Caleb Cross. He didn't wait for her to recover. With a low whistle, he spurred the horse back into a trot. As the hours bled into one another, the heat became a physical enemy. The sun beat down on Evelyn's unprotected head, her bonnet having been lost in the initial struggle. Every lurch of the horse forced her back into him, a constant punishing reminder of her captivity. She tried to hold herself rigid, to keep an inch of space between her pride and his power, but exhaustion eventually won. Her head began to droop, her forehead coming to rest against the side of his neck. She hated how safe he felt. That was the most confusing part of the psychology of her fear. He was her captor, the man who had stolen her life. Yet his body was a fortress against the elements. He was steady. He was strong. He didn't complain about the heat or the weight. He simply rode, his eyes scanning the horizon with a predatory focus. "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the clatter of hooves. "Why take a job like this? You could have been anything. A soldier, a lawman." "Lawmen don't get paid until the trial is over," Caleb replied, his eyes never leaving the ridgeline. "Bounty hunters get paid as soon as the collateral is delivered, and I've got a long memory for debts, Evelyn. Your brother took something from people who don't forgive. I'm just the hand that reaches out to collect." "Has my brother," she defended, though she knew Julian's faults better than anyone. "He's weak, but he's not evil." "Weakness is the most expensive thing in the West," Caleb said, his voice dropping to a somber tone. "It costs the people around you everything. It costs you your silk bed and your fancy tea, and if I don't get you to the border by tomorrow night, it'll cost you a lot more than that." Evelyn closed her eyes, leaning back into him despite herself. The scent of him, tobacco, rain-washed leather, and a deep masculine musk was starting to override the scent of the desert. She was falling into a trance, a rhythmic, hypnotic state where the only two things in the world were the horse beneath her and the giant behind her. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and bruised purple, Caleb steered the horse toward a cluster of jagged rocks that rose from the sand like a set of broken teeth. "We stop here," he announced. He dismounted in one fluid, athletic motion, his spurs jingling with a sound that felt like a countdown. He reached up, his massive hands spanning her waist, and lifted her down, as if she weighed no more than a child. When her feet hit the ground, her knees buckled. She had been in the saddle for 6 hours, and her legs were numb and weak. Caleb caught her before she hit the dust, his chest a wall of heat that she found herself clutching at for balance. For a long, heart-stopping moment, he didn't let go. He held her there, his hands firm on her hips, his gray eyes searching her face, the fire of the sunset reflected in his pupils, making them look like molten silver. "You did all right today, little bird," he murmured, his voice losing some of its edge. Evelyn looked up at him, her lips parted, her breath hitching. The fear was still there, but it was being crowded out by something else. A strange proprietary pull she felt in her lower belly. She should have pushed him away. She should have screamed. Instead, she found herself staring at the line of his jaw, wondering what it would feel like if he actually followed through on his threat. "Don't call me that," she whispered, her voice lacking any real conviction. Caleb's grip tightened just a fraction, his gaze dropping to her mouth. "I'll call you whatever I want, Evelyn. As long as you're under my shadow, you belong to the trail, and the trail is a jealous master." He let go of her abruptly, turning to unsaddle the horse, leaving her standing in the cooling desert air, shivering not from the cold, but from the realization that the man who had stolen her was the only thing keeping her alive, and she was starting to like the way he looked at her. The first night was just beginning, and Evelyn knew that by the time the sun rose, she would never be the same woman again. The fire was a small, flickering heartbeat in the vast, devouring ribcage of the canyon. As night fully claimed the desert, the temperature plummeted, turning the air from a furnace into a wetted blade of cold. Evelyn huddled on a flat rock, her torn silk skirts tucked around her legs, watching Caleb move. He didn't move like the men in Philadelphia. There was no wasted motion, no performative grace. Every step he took was calculated, a survivalist's ballet. He had gathered scrub brush and dried mesquite, building a flame that cast long, distorted shadows against the red rock walls. In the orange light, he looked less like a man and more like some ancient, vengeful spirit of the frontier. "Eat," Caleb said, his voice cutting through the crackle of the wood. He handed her a piece of hardtack and a thin strip of salted beef. Evelyn stared at the meager offering. Back home, dinner was 5 courses served on Haviland china. Her stomach twisted, not just with hunger, but with a profound sense of displacement. She took the food, her fingers trembling as they brushed his. This time, he didn't pull away immediately. He let his hand linger for a heartbeat, his calloused skin a jarring contrast to her softness. "It's not what you're used to," he murmured, crouching across from her. He had removed his hat, revealing dark, wind-tossed hair and a brow that seemed perpetually furrowed by the weight of the world. "But it'll keep your blood moving. The desert doesn't care about your palate, Evelyn." "Is that all I am to you?" she asked, her voice gaining a sudden sharp edge. "A ledger to be balanced, a piece of property to be kept moving until you can trade me for a bag of gold." Caleb took a slow, deliberate bite of his own rations, his gray eyes fixed on her. The firelight danced in his pupils, making him look predatory. "In this territory, everyone is property. Your brother gambled yours away the moment he put his mark on a debt he couldn't pay. I'm just the man making sure the contract is honored." "You talk as if you have no choice," Evelyn countered, leaning forward, the heat of the fire stinging her face. "You could let me go. You could tell them I died in the desert. You're strong enough to disappear. Why choose to be a monster?" Caleb's jaw tightened, a muscle leaping in his cheek. He stood up, the movement so sudden and powerful that Evelyn flinched. He walked toward her, his spurs jingling with a slow, rhythmic finality. He didn't stop until he was standing over her, his shadow swallowing her whole. "You want to know why I don't let you go?" he rasped, his voice dropping to a dangerous low register. "Because if I let you go, you're dead. If I don't deliver you to the men at the border, they'll send worse than me to find you. Men who don't care about collateral. Men who would use every inch of that silk and skin before they let you breathe your last." He reached down, his hand wrapping around her upper arm, pulling her to her feet with an effortless strength that made her feel weightless. He brought her close, so close she could smell the smoke on his skin and the raw, honest scent of a man who lived under the sky. "You call me a monster because I took you," he whispered, his face inches from hers. "But out here, I'm the only thing standing between you and the real demons. You're mine to protect, Evelyn, and I take my jobs very seriously." Evelyn's heart was a drum in her ears, a frantic, wild rhythm that matched the pulsing heat in her blood. She should have been repulsed. She should have fought him. But the psychological wall she had built around herself, the wall of the governor's daughter, was crumbling. The desert had stripped away her status, and Caleb Cross was stripping away her inhibitions. "You're hurting me," she lied, her voice a breathless whisper. He wasn't hurting her. He was grounding her. Caleb looked down at his hand on her arm, his grip loosening, but he didn't let go. His thumb began to move, tracing a slow, agonizing circle against her skin. "I haven't even begun to hurt you, little bird, and I haven't begun to show you what it's like to be truly held." He let his gaze drop to her lips, and for a moment the world stopped spinning. The silence of the canyon was absolute, a vacuum waiting to be filled. Evelyn felt a terrifying urge to lean in, to surrender to the gravity of him. She wanted to know if his mouth was as hard as his words, or if there was a hidden softness beneath the steel. She broke the gaze first, looking down at the buttons of his vest. You said if I made you stop again, I'd ride you before I touched the saddle." Caleb's breath hitched. The air between them grew thick, charged with a tension that felt like a coming storm. "I remember what I said." "Well," Evelyn whispered, her courage born of a desperate, lonely madness. "The horse is rested, but I'm still standing on the ground." The control in Caleb shattered. A low, guttural sound escaped his throat as he surged forward, his hands sliding from her arms to her waist, dragging her flush against the hard, unyielding line of his body. He claimed her mouth not with a question, but with an answer. It was a devastating kiss, a collision of two worlds that should never have met. He tasted of grit and salt and a wild, untamed freedom. Evelyn gasped against his lips, her hands flying up to clutch at his shoulders, her fingers digging into the heavy fabric of his shirt. This was the unmaking she had feared. This was the moment she ceased to be a lady and became a creature of the frontier. He backed her up until her spine hit the cool, rough surface of the canyon wall. His body followed, pinning her there, his weight a suffocating, intoxicating pressure. His hands were everywhere, tracing the line of her throat, tangling in her hair, bunching the silk of her skirts. "Is this what you wanted?" Caleb growled against her skin, his mouth moving to the sensitive hollow of her neck. "To see if the monster had a heart? I want to feel alive." Evelyn sobbed, her head falling back as his teeth grazed her collarbone. "For once in my life, I just want to feel something that isn't a lie." Caleb pulled back just enough to look her in the eyes. His face was a mask of pained ecstasy, his gray eyes dark with a storm of hunger and something that looked dangerously like reverence. He reached down, unbuckling his gun belt and letting it drop into the sand with a heavy thud, a symbolic shedding of his profession. "Then feel this," he whispered. He lifted her, her legs instinctively wrapping around his waist, the torn silk of her gown riding up to reveal the pale, moonlight-washed skin of her thighs. He carried her toward the bedroll he had spread by the fire, his movements heavy and deliberate. When he laid her down, the heat of the fire was on one side of her, and the heat of Caleb Cross was on the other. He began to undo the laces of her corset, his large, calloused fingers working with a surprising, torturous patience. Each loop he freed felt like a chain breaking. As the whalebone loosened, Evelyn felt she could finally breathe. Not just air, but the scent of her own awakening. He hovered over her, a giant silhouetted against the dying embers. He began to shed his own clothes, his body revealed as a map of scars and hard-won muscle. He was magnificent and terrifying. A man built by the very desert that was trying to kill them. "Last chance, Evelyn," he said, his voice a rough caress. "Once we cross this line, there's no going back to Philadelphia. You won't be able to look at a teacup or a ballroom without thinking of the sand on your back and my hands on your skin." Evelyn reached up, her fingers tracing the jagged scar across his chest. She didn't want to go back. She didn't want the lace. She wanted the man who had seen her at her weakest and made her feel like a queen. "Let the world burn," she whispered. "Just don't stop." As the fire turned to ash and the stars wheeled overhead, the bounty hunter and the lady were lost in a primal rhythm that spoke of more than just debt and collateral. It was a joining of two lost souls in the middle of a beautiful, heartless wasteland. But as Evelyn drifted into a heavy, satiated sleep in the circle of Caleb's arm, she didn't see the dark shapes moving on the ridgeline above. She didn't see the glint of a rifle barrel in the moonlight. The debt was being collected, but Caleb Cross wasn't the only one coming for the price. The dawn did not break gently. It bled across the horizon in jagged streaks of crimson and gold, as if the sky itself had been wounded. Evelyn woke to the heavy, grounding weight of Caleb's arm across her waist. For a few heartbeats, the nightmare of the previous days felt like a fever dream, replaced by the reality of the man beside her. She watched the steady rise and fall of his chest, the way the morning light caught the scars on his shoulders, reminders of a life spent in the crosshairs. She was no longer the porcelain doll of Philadelphia. Her skin was dusted with sand, her hair was a tangled auburn halo, and her heart felt wider, more dangerous than it had ever been. Caleb's eyes snapped open, instantly alert. He didn't wake with the slow grogginess of a city man. He woke like a predator, already scanning the perimeter. He saw her watching him, and for a fleeting second, the hardness in his gaze softened into something that looked like grief. "We have to move," he rasped, his voice thicker than the night before. "The border is 6 miles out. Once we're across, my contract is done." "And then what?" Evelyn asked, her voice steady. "Do you just hand me over and ride back into the dust?" Caleb didn't answer. He stood, pulling on his boots and cinching his gun belt with a grim finality. The silence was his answer, and it tasted like ash in her mouth. He reached down to help her up, but before their fingers could meet, the sharp crack of a rifle shot echoed through the canyon, shattering the morning peace. The bullet whined off the rock inches from Caleb's head. "Get down!" he roared, lunging for her. He tackled her behind the cover of a fallen boulder, just as a second shot kicked up the sand where she had been lying. From the ridgeline above, 3 riders appeared, silhouettes against the rising sun. They weren't lawmen. They were the debt collectors Caleb had warned her about. Men led by a scar-faced mercenary named Silas Vane, a man who made Caleb look like a saint. "Cross!" Vane's voice boomed, echoing off the canyon walls. "The governor's daughter is worth twice as much if she's delivered early. Why don't you save us the ammunition and hand her over? You can keep your gold and your life." Caleb checked his revolvers, his face a mask of cold iron. He looked at Evelyn, his gray eyes burning with a desperate, protective fire. "Listen to me," he whispered, grabbing her hand. "There's a crevice behind these rocks. It leads down to the wash. You run. Don't look back. You head south until you hit the Rio Grande. Do you understand?" "I'm not leaving you," she defied, clutching his vest. "Evelyn, look at me." He gripped her face in his hands, his thumbs grazing her cheeks. "I was hired to collect a debt, but I'm ending this as a man who's found something worth more than a bounty. You go, now. If you're enjoying this tale of fire and frontier grit, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more stories of forbidden love and high-stakes adventure. Comment below. Should Evelyn run, or should she stay and fight for the man who stole her heart? Desperate bid to draw their fire, she saw her brother's silver-handled pistol, the one Caleb had confiscated and tucked into his saddlebag, resting just a few feet away. Caleb was a whirlwind of lead and fury, but he was outnumbered. He took a bullet to the shoulder, the force of it, spinning him around. Vane laughed, a hollow metallic sound, as he began to descend the slope, his rifle aimed at Caleb's heart. "You got soft, Cross," Vane sneered. "Getting a taste of the silk made you weak." Vane raised his rifle, finger tightening on the trigger, but before he could fire, a different sound rang out, the sharp, high-pitched report of a smaller caliber pistol. The bullet took Vane in the thigh, sending him tumbling down the rocky incline. Standing at the edge of the boulder, her hands shaking but her gaze fixed, was Evelyn. She held the silver pistol with both hands, the lavender silk of her sleeves fluttering in the wind like a battle flag. "Get away from him," she commanded, her voice ringing with the authority of a woman who had finally claimed her own power. The distraction was all Caleb needed. Despite the blood soaking his shirt, he lunged forward, disarming the remaining riders with a surgical precision born of years of violence. Within minutes, the canyon fell silent again, save for the moans of the wounded men and the heavy, ragged breathing of the survivors. Caleb slumped against a rock, clutching his shoulder. Evelyn dropped the gun and ran to him, falling to her knees in the dirt. She tore a strip of her own dress, the expensive, useless silk, and began to bind his wound with focused, trembling hands. "You stayed," Caleb whispered, staring at her as if she were a ghost. "You could have been halfway to the border." "I told you," she said, her eyes welling with tears as she knotted the silk tight. "I'm not the girl you kidnapped. You unmade her, Caleb. You have to live with the woman you left in her place." Caleb reached out with his good arm, pulling her toward him until their foreheads rested against each other. The blood and the dust between them didn't matter. The debt was gone. The contract was shredded. "Where do we go?" she asked. "My father will still look for me. These men will still come." Caleb looked toward the horizon, where the desert stretched out, infinite and lawless. For the first time, he didn't see a trail to be hunted. He saw a home to be built. "We go where the law doesn't have a name," he said. "We go where a bounty hunter can be a husband and a lady can be free." They reached the border by noon, but they didn't cross it into the waiting arms of the authorities. Instead, they turned west toward the mountains. Evelyn sat in the saddle this time, her back straight, her hands holding the reins. Caleb sat behind her, his arm wrapped possessively around her waist, his head resting against her shoulder. They were no longer captor and collateral. They were two outlaws in a world that demanded they be enemies, riding toward a sun that didn't care about their past. As the dust settled behind them, Evelyn looked back one last time at the life she had left. The Philadelphia tea rooms, the lace, the suffocating rules, they were all just shadows in the red dirt. She turned, forward, leaning back into the heat of the man she had chosen. The debt was paid in full, and for the first time in her life, Lady Evelyn was exactly where she wanted to be,